Long before the first dinosaur took a step, and long before birds crossed the sky, Earth briefly became a planet that could build monsters from creatures that should have remained small. 300 million years ago, the largest flying animal on Earth was an insect. Its wings stretched 75 centimeters across. It hunted in a sky no bird had ever entered, because birds did not yet exist. On the ground below, a millipede more than 2.5 meters long moved through forests, unlike anything alive today. Nearby, giant scorpions hunted through dense undergrowth beneath trees that would eventually become the coal seams buried beneath modern cities. Something about this world had changed. The atmosphere contained far more oxygen than it does today. Wildfires burned with an intensity almost impossible to imagine. Forests spread across vast tropical wetlands, and the conditions they created allowed life to push beyond limits that seem impossible now. But this strange age did not last. The window opened. Giant insects appeared. For tens of millions of years they flourished. Then the world changed again, and almost as quickly as they arrived, the monsters disappeared. If you're settling in with this one, consider giving the video a like and subscribing. And let me know in the comments, what part of the world are you watching from tonight? Imagine opening a book so old that its pages are made not of paper but of stone. Between those pages lies the Carboniferous, a chapter of Earth's history that stretched from 358.9 million years ago to 298.9 million years ago, lasting exactly 60 million years. It was a span of time so immense that entire mountain ranges rose while forests spread across continents, and yet it formed only one passage in the much longer story of the planet. Its name comes from the Latin word carbo, meaning coal. The title was given long after the age itself had ended by people who uncovered vast black seams buried beneath the ground. Those seams were the remains of ancient landscapes, compressed and transformed through unimaginable lengths of time. The Carboniferous is one of the few periods named directly for what it left behind, a geological signature written into the crust of the earth. The world itself was in motion. Continents that had once drifted separately were gradually converging. Africa pressed steadily toward eastern North America, and the force of that collision lifted enormous folds of rock skyward. The foundations of the Appalachian Mountains emerged during this process, their roots forming deep beneath forests that would vanish long before the mountains reached their full height. Climate followed different rules than those familiar today. No permanent ice caps crowned the poles. Warm conditions extended across much of the globe, and tropical environments reached astonishing latitudes. In equatorial regions, temperatures commonly ranged between 20 degrees Celsius and 30 degrees Celsius. Seasons, as modern organisms experience them, were faint or absent. Fossil plants from this period often lack growth rings, revealing years that passed without the strong seasonal interruptions recorded by trees today. Across the equatorial belt stretched immense lowland wetlands. Water moved slowly through these landscapes, collecting in broad swampy basins where humidity lingered continuously in the air. Rivers wandered through dense vegetation, depositing sediments while flooding and retreating in endless cycles. The ground remained saturated, creating conditions that favored forms of life, unlike those dominating modern forests. Towering above these wetlands were the lycopsids, often called scale trees. Their trunks rose straight upward like living columns, marked by repeating diamond-shaped scars left behind by fallen leaves. Many remained branchless for most of their height, producing crowns only near the top. Some reached 50 meters into the air, with trunks exceeding 1 meter in diameter. Although they resembled trees, They belong to a lineage far removed from modern oaks, pines, or maples. Beneath them spread a layered world of giant horsetails, ferns, and dense vegetation adapted to perpetual moisture. Life filled every available space. The atmosphere hung heavy above the swamps, carrying the products of countless leaves, capturing sunlight day after day. Far overhead, insects already moved through the warm air. Some had begun growing beyond familiar proportions. Yet the explanation did not begin with the insects themselves. It began quietly inside the tissues of plants, with an evolutionary innovation that would alter the chemistry of the atmosphere and reshape the limits of animal life. Long before giant insects crossed the sky, a quiet innovation appeared in the plant kingdom. It did not roar, hunt, or spread across the landscape in a dramatic wave. It emerged cell by cell during the Devonian period, when certain plants discovered a new way to support their own weight. For the first time, living structures could rise far above the ground without collapsing under gravity's constant pull. The secret was lignin. Hidden within the walls of plant cells, this remarkable material acted like a natural reinforcing framework. Chemically complex and rich in carbon, lignin strengthens stems and trunks, allowing plants to grow upward with a confidence unseen in earlier vegetation. Forests began to change. What had once been a world dominated by low growth gradually gained height, depth, and vertical complexity. The consequences reached far beyond appearance. Tall trees could spread their leaves across broader areas, gathering more sunlight and converting greater amounts of carbon dioxide into organic matter. Forests expanded their influence over the atmosphere itself, drawing carbon from the air and locking it into wood, bark, roots, and leaves. Each generation added more biological material to the landscape than the one before. Ordinarily, such material would eventually return to the atmosphere. When plants die, decomposers break them apart, releasing stored carbon and consuming oxygen as they work. This recycling process is one of the quiet foundations of life on Earth. Yet lignin introduced an unexpected complication. Microbial life had experience dealing with cellulose, the simpler substance found throughout plant tissues. Cellulose could be dismantled and reused. Lignin was different. Its structure was intricate, durable, and resistant to attack. The enzymes necessary to efficiently digest it had not yet evolved. The forests had discovered a new material, but the rest of the living world had not caught up. As a result, fallen trees lingered where they landed. Storms brought them down. Floodwaters carried them into low-lying wetlands. Trunks settled into saturated ground where oxygen levels were already low. There they remained, not disappearing in the familiar manner of modern forests, but accumulating layer upon layer. Across vast stretches of the Carboniferous landscape, enormous quantities of plant matter entered a geological waiting room. Dead wood collected in swamps, bogs, and stagnant waterways. Centuries passed, then millennia, then millions of years. Fresh vegetation continued growing overhead, while the remains of earlier forests slowly buried themselves beneath new deposits. This imbalance altered the chemistry of the planet. Photosynthesis continued producing oxygen, releasing it into the atmosphere each day. Yet much of the organic matter responsible for that oxygen was no longer decomposing efficiently. The usual return pathway had weakened. Carbon remained locked underground, while oxygen increasingly remained above it. No organism intended this outcome. Trees evolved lignin because stronger bodies offered advantages in competition for sunlight. Microbes simply lacked the biological tools to dismantle the new material. The atmosphere responded to their interaction with quiet inevitability. Over tens of millions of years, oxygen accumulated beyond levels familiar to the modern world, not through design or direction, but through a mismatch between innovation and adaptation, preserved in the deep wetlands of an ancient Earth. Air is easy to overlook. It has no shape that can be held, no color that marks its boundaries, and no visible architecture announcing its presence. Yet during the later Carboniferous, the atmosphere itself became one of the most unusual environments on Earth, as significant to life as any ocean, forest, or mountain range. Over millions of years, the imbalance created by accumulating plant material continued to grow. Carbon remained trapped beneath the surface, while photosynthesis carried on above it. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, the composition of the atmosphere shifted. By the late Carboniferous, oxygen levels had climbed to approximately 35%. Today, oxygen accounts for about 21% of the air. The difference may appear modest when written as numbers, yet every breath in that ancient world contained roughly two-thirds more oxygen than a breath taken today. The atmosphere was not only richer in oxygen, it was also denser. Estimates suggest atmospheric pressure approached approximately 1.3 bar, compared with roughly 1.0 bar in the modern world. The air pressed more firmly against every surface. Winds moved through a thicker medium. Flying organisms encountered conditions unlike those experienced by their descendants hundreds of millions of years later. One consequence appeared wherever organic material accumulated. Fire, an ancient process already present on Earth, behaved differently under these conditions. Laboratory experiments have shown that combustion struggles to sustain itself when oxygen levels fall below approximately 13%. At 35%, the opposite problem emerged. Materials that would normally resist ignition became increasingly vulnerable. Moist vegetation could burn, damp plant matter could participate in spreading flames. Landscapes that today might smolder reluctantly became capable of supporting extensive fires. The atmosphere supplied combustion with extraordinary efficiency, feeding flames with a continuous abundance of oxygen. Evidence of these ancient fires remains preserved in the geological record. Within Carboniferous coal seams, researchers repeatedly encounter layers rich in fossil charcoal. Geologists call this material fusane. It forms when vegetation burns and is later buried, preserving a carbonized memory of wildfire activity. In some coal deposits, fusane represents between 10% and 20% of the total volume, an astonishing proportion that speaks to repeated burning across immense spans of time. Certain studies suggest major fire events may have occurred at intervals of roughly 500 years or even less in some regions. Across geological timescales, this created a recurring rhythm. Vegetation expanded, accumulated, burned, recovered, and accumulated again. The process unfolded for millions of years beneath skies carrying an atmosphere unlike any living creature experiences today. This was not a world of constant flames. Much of the time, forests remained alive and thriving, yet the possibility of ignition lingered everywhere, woven into the chemistry of the air itself. The same oxygen that supported lush plant growth also increased the reach and persistence of fire. Meanwhile, another consequence was quietly unfolding within the bodies of arthropods. The atmosphere that fed these vast combustion cycles also altered the biological limits that had constrained insects for hundreds of millions of years. As oxygen became more abundant and easier to access, body sizes that would once have been difficult or impossible began moving within reach. The air had changed, and life was beginning to respond. Inside every insect exists an invisible architecture, a network so delicate that it leaves almost no impression from the outside. Wings may catch the eye, and legs may carry the body across a leaf or through the air, yet neither explains the extraordinary sizes reached during the Carboniferous. The explanation lies within a hidden system that operates according to principles very different from those used by vertebrate animals. A mammal draws air into lungs. Oxygen enters the bloodstream and is transported throughout the body by specialized cells. Distance is not a major obstacle because blood serves as a delivery network, carrying oxygen from one location to another. Insects follow a different path entirely. They possess no lungs. Their blood, known as hemolymph, does not function as an oxygen transport system in the way vertebrate blood does. Instead, oxygen travels through an intricate arrangement of internal tubes called tracheae. These branching passages extend throughout the body, dividing repeatedly into ever smaller channels until they reach tissues and individual cells. The entrances to this system are tiny openings known as spiracles, located along the sides of the body, particularly around the abdomen. These openings allow air to pass inward. From there, oxygen moves through the tracheal network by diffusion. No pump drives the process. No heart pushes oxygen toward distant tissues. Molecules simply move from areas where oxygen is abundant toward areas where it is less concentrated. At modest sizes, this arrangement is remarkably effective. An insect can remain lightweight while delivering oxygen directly to the places where it is needed. The system helped insects become one of the most successful groups of animals in Earth's history, yet hidden within its elegance is a limitation. As an insect grows larger, the distance between the outside air and its deepest tissues increases. Reaching those tissues requires longer and wider tracheal tubes. More branches must penetrate deeper into muscles and organs. Gradually, the respiratory network begins occupying a greater proportion of the body's internal volume. Imagine a city expanding while its roads grow thicker and more numerous with every new district. Eventually, the transportation network begins consuming space that could otherwise be used for homes, workplaces, and public squares. A similar constraint emerges within large insects. The larger the body becomes, the more room must be devoted to the infrastructure required to supply oxygen. Modern research has provided a detailed view of this limitation. Using synchrotron X ray imaging, scientists at Arizona State University examined the internal anatomy of beetles across a range of sizes. Their findings revealed that tracheal volume increases dramatically as body size increases. In smaller beetles, the tracheal system occupies roughly 0.5% of total body volume. In larger species, that figure rises to approximately 4.8%. The effect becomes even more pronounced within the legs. In the largest beetles studied, tracheal structures may occupy up to 18% of leg volume, a substantial investment of internal space dedicated solely to delivering oxygen. During the Carboniferous, the atmosphere changed the equation. With oxygen levels reaching approximately 35%, diffusion became far more efficient. Oxygen could travel deeper into tissues without requiring proportionally larger tracheal networks. The same body could receive more oxygen while devoting less space to respiratory plumbing. The ceiling remained, but it rose higher, creating biological room for insects to explore sizes rarely seen before or since. The first clue arrived as a pattern pressed into stone. In the coal-bearing deposits of Commentry, France, fossil wings emerged from rock layers that had once belonged to a vanished world. When French paleontologist Charles Brongniart studied these remains in 1885, he realized they belonged to an insect unlike anything alive today. The creature would later be named Meganeura. and with it came one of the most extraordinary aerial predators in Earth's history. At full size, Meganeura stretched across the air with a wingspan of approximately 65 to 75 centimeters. Individual wings could reach lengths of up to 32 centimeters. Estimates of body mass vary considerably, ranging from roughly 17 grams to 150 grams, depending on the specimen and reconstruction. Whatever the exact figure, its dimensions placed it far beyond the scale of modern dragonflies. Yet Meganeura was not actually a dragonfly. It belonged to an extinct group known as the Meganeroptera, often called griffinflies. They were close relatives of modern dragonflies and damselflies, but formed their own distinct lineage. For tens of millions of years, beginning in the late Carboniferous and continuing well into the Permian, griffinflies occupied a role that no insect would ever hold again. They were the dominant aerial hunters of their age. Their anatomy reveals how they achieved it. Meganeura possessed enormous compound eyes, positioned so closely together that they met along the midline of the head. This arrangement provided an extraordinary field of view, allowing movement to be detected from nearly every direction. Modern dragonflies retain a similar visual design and are among the most successful predators alive, with hunting success rates estimated at around 95%. Meganeura appears to have inherited the same fundamental strategy, refined on a much larger frame. Flight was not merely a means of travel, it was a hunting platform. Long before birds entered the sky, these insects were already pursuing prey through open air. Their front legs were equipped with sturdy spines and could be extended forward during flight, creating a basket-like structure. An approaching insect had little chance to evade capture once trapped within that living net. The skies Meganeura patrolled were crowded with potential prey. Numerous insect groups had already expanded in size under the atmospheric conditions of the Carboniferous. Large, herbivorous forms moved among the vegetation, while other predatory species pursued their own opportunities. Some researchers propose that this abundance of increasingly large prey helped encourage griffinfly gigantism. As prey became larger and more capable, predators benefited from matching them in scale and power. Another factor may have been equally important. The air belonged to insects alone. No birds crossed these ancient skies. No bats hunted after dusk. Flying reptiles had not yet appeared. The vertebrate takeover of the atmosphere remained far in the future. Without aerial predators imposing limits on body size, large insects faced fewer penalties for growing bigger. Oxygen expanded the biological possibilities, but ecological freedom allowed those possibilities to be explored. In that unusual combination of atmosphere and opportunity, Meganeura became something rare in Earth's history. An insect that occupied the role of a top aerial predator, gliding above the Carboniferous world with few rivals and no natural masters overhead. Sometimes an entire creature is known from almost nothing. A fragment of wing preserved in stone, a pattern of veins pressed into ancient sediment, a shape incomplete enough to fit within a human hand. Yet from such fragments, a remarkable animal can emerge, reconstructed piece by piece across decades of careful study. In 1939, paleontologist Frank Carpenter examined fossil material recovered from the Wellington Formation of Kansas, a rock unit dating to the Permian period. What he described would become one of the most celebrated insects in the fossil record. The animal was named Meganeuropsis permiana, and despite being known from incomplete remains, it remains the largest flying insect ever discovered. Its dimensions are difficult to imagine in modern terms because no living insect approaches them. The preserved wing measured approximately 71 centimeters in length. From this and related specimens, researchers estimated a total wingspan of roughly 75 centimeters. The body itself may have stretched between 43 and 47 centimeters long. Weight estimates exceed 450 grams, placing the animal within the mass range of a modern crow rather than a typical insect. The original fossil, incomplete though it was, revealed enough of the wing structure to identify its relationship to the griffinflies. Today, that specimen is housed in the Museum of Comparative Zoology at Harvard University, where it remains one of the most important records of insect gigantism ever found. The story expanded only a year later. In 1940, another giant griffinfly fossil was discovered near Noble, Oklahoma. It was assigned to a second species, Meganeuropsis americana. Some researchers have since suggested that the two forms may actually represent the same species. Regardless of the final classification, the Oklahoma specimen preserved the largest individual wing fragment yet recovered from any insect, strengthening the picture of a predator operating at a scale almost unimaginable for an arthropod. These discoveries were not isolated curiosities. Fossils belonging to the griffinfly lineage have been recovered from locations scattered across what are now France, Kansas, Oklahoma, Russia, and China. During the late Carboniferous and Permian, these distant regions were connected within the broader configuration of Pangaea. The distribution suggests that griffinflies were not restricted to a single ecosystem or continent. They were widespread inhabitants of the ancient world. Their longevity is equally striking. The lineage first appeared approximately 317 million years ago and persisted until around 247 million years ago. This span of roughly 70 million years exceeds the entire duration of many famous groups of prehistoric animals. Generation after generation occupied the skies while continents shifted, climates changed, and ecosystems transformed beneath them. Such endurance hints at a successful design. Large compound eyes, powerful flight muscles, and efficient aerial hunting strategies allowed griffinflies to thrive across immense stretches of time. They were not evolutionary experiments that briefly appeared and vanished. They formed a stable and dominant presence in ancient ecosystems, occupying a role unmatched in the modern world. The largest among them, Meganeuropsis, stands at the far edge of what insect anatomy could achieve. Its existence marks the highest known point of insect flight size, a moment when atmospheric conditions and ecological opportunity aligned closely enough to support a creature that has never been equaled since. Not every giant of the Carboniferous took to the air. While immense insects moved above the landscape, another creature occupied a very different world, one measured not in altitude, but in distance across the forest floor. It traveled through shadows, over fallen vegetation, and across soft ground, leaving behind traces that would endure for hundreds of millions of years. Its name was Arthropleura. Among all known land invertebrates, no larger example has ever been discovered. This extraordinary arthropod, a distant relative of modern millipedes, reached lengths of approximately 2.6 meters and widths approaching half a meter. Estimates of weight remain uncertain, but the animal likely outweighed many modern dogs. Its segmented body stretched across the landscape like a living train of armor plates, supported by numerous pairs of legs moving in coordinated waves beneath it. Unlike many carboniferous creatures, Arthropleura is known not only from body fossils, but also from its footprints. Across ancient deposits in Scotland and Germany, researchers have uncovered fossil trackways preserved in sediments that were once soft mud. These impressions reveal a broad-bodied animal moving with steady confidence through its environment. Even when the body itself is absent, The tracks communicate scale. They show the width of the creature, the spacing of its limbs, and the paths it followed through ancient ecosystems. Today, Scotland and Germany lie far from the equator. During the Carboniferous, however, these regions occupied very different positions on the globe. They existed within warm tropical zones where moisture remained abundant and vegetation flourished. The habitats supporting Arthropleura were rich, humid landscapes filled with plant life, unlike anything familiar today. Its enormous size might suggest a formidable predator, yet the evidence points elsewhere. The mouthparts known from fossil specimens appear adapted for processing plant material rather than capturing prey. No specialized hunting structures have been identified. No venom delivery systems have been found. Instead, researchers conclude that Arthropleura most likely fed on ferns, mosses, and decaying vegetation scattered across the ground. This dietary preference reveals something important about the world it inhabited. Sustaining a body more than 2 meters long requires a substantial and reliable food supply. The forest floor must have provided vast quantities of organic material, enough to support populations of giant herbivorous arthropods. Layer after layer of vegetation accumulated within these ecosystems, creating a persistent source of nutrition for creatures capable of processing it. Arthropleura occupied a role unlike that of the aerial predators above. It was not chasing prey through open space. Instead, it participated in the slow recycling of plant matter, moving through ecosystems built upon extraordinary biological productivity. Its success depended on the stability of those environments and the abundance they provided. For millions of years, that arrangement endured, yet the conditions that allowed Arthropleura to thrive gradually changed. As the Carboniferous drew toward its close, atmospheric oxygen began to decline from its peak levels. Climatic patterns shifted. Wet habitats fragmented and contracted. The expansive swamp environments that had sustained giant arthropods became less widespread. By approximately 303 million years ago, during the Xelian stage of the late Carboniferous, Arthropleura disappeared from the fossil record. Its departure marked the loss of one of the most remarkable land animals ever produced by the invertebrate world, a creature whose size reflected the unusual conditions of an Earth that no longer existed. Among the sediments of an ancient volcanic landscape in Scotland lies a remarkable archive known as East Kirkton Quarry. Today it appears quiet and unassuming, but hundreds of millions of years ago it preserved a thriving terrestrial ecosystem at a time when life on land was still experimenting with new possibilities. From this single location emerged one of the most formidable arthropod predators of the Carboniferous world, a giant scorpion called Pulmonoscorpius kirktonensis. Unlike some of its distant relatives that remained tied to aquatic environments, Pulmonoscorpius was fully terrestrial. It lived its entire life on land, moving through warm equatorial habitats that occupied what is now Scotland during the early Carboniferous. The region sat far from its present latitude, positioned within a tropical zone where moisture, vegetation, and animal life flourished across extensive wetlands and forested terrain. Its size alone set it apart. Pulmonoscorpius reached lengths of approximately 70 centimeters, making it more than 3 times larger than the largest scorpions alive today. Stretched out, it approached the length of a baseball bat. Its segmented tail curved above the body, while sturdy pincers projected forward, creating a silhouette instantly recognizable, even across immense spans of evolutionary time. Yet scale was only part of the story. Researchers examining fossil specimens noticed that Pulmonoscorpius possessed unusually large eyes compared with many modern scorpions. Most living scorpions rely heavily on sensing vibrations through the ground and detecting subtle chemical cues in their environment. Vision often plays a secondary role. Pulmonoscorpius may have followed a different strategy. Its enlarged eyes suggest an animal that depended more strongly on visual information. In the dim and complex environments of the Carboniferous landscape, the ability to detect movement at a distance could provide a significant advantage. Rather than waiting passively for prey to approach, it may have actively searched its surroundings, locating opportunities through sight as well as touch. The menu available to such a hunter was substantial. Large arthropods were becoming increasingly common throughout these ecosystems. Juvenile insects, millipede relatives, and other invertebrates likely formed an important part of its diet. Some researchers also suggest that small tetrapods may occasionally have fallen within its hunting range. These early four-limbed vertebrates were only beginning to establish themselves on land, and many remained modest in size. What makes Pulmonoscorpius particularly valuable to science is the context in which it is found. Every known specimen comes from East Kirkton Quarry, approximately 20 miles west of modern Edinburgh. The site preserves an unusually detailed snapshot of terrestrial life during the early Carboniferous, capturing plants, arthropods, and vertebrates within the same ancient environment. Through this window, researchers can examine not merely an isolated species, but an entire community. Pulmonoscorpius was impressive, yet it was not an exception. Across the Carboniferous landscape, size increases appeared in multiple arthropod groups at roughly the same time. Giant insects occupied the air. Massive millipede relatives moved across the ground. Large predatory scorpions hunted among them. This broader pattern is one reason scientists view atmospheric conditions as such a powerful influence. The trend extended beyond a single lineage or ecological niche. Many unrelated arthropods were pushing against the upper limits of body size simultaneously. Pulmonoscorpius was one expression of that larger experiment, a predator shaped by a world where the boundaries of arthropod growth had expanded far beyond those familiar today. A world is rarely defined by its most famous inhabitants alone. The Carboniferous is often remembered through the silhouettes of giant griffinflies, enormous millipede relatives, and predatory scorpions. Yet, these creatures occupied only part of a much broader community. Across wetlands, vegetation, and shallow waterways lived a remarkable collection of arthropods, many of them larger than anything their modern descendants would ever become. Among the most abundant were ancient relatives of cockroaches. These insects belonged to lineages, often grouped under the informal term rhoecoids. Although they resembled modern cockroaches in general appearance, many reached dimensions far exceeding those familiar today. Broad-bodied and well-adapted to humid environments, they moved through layers of vegetation and organic debris, feeding on available plant material and contributing to the flow of nutrients through the ecosystem. Their presence highlights an important pattern. Gigantism was not restricted to predators. Herbivores, scavengers, and generalist feeders were also increasing in size. The phenomenon extended across ecological roles, affecting multiple groups simultaneously rather than favoring a single evolutionary path. Some of the strangest inhabitants belong to a group called the Paleodictyopterans. These insects possessed body plans unlike anything alive in the modern world. Certain species carried an additional pair of wing-like structures positioned between the forewings and hindwings, giving the appearance of 6 wings rather than 4. No living insect retains this arrangement. One notable example was Mazothyros. Its body length exceeded half a meter, and its wings spread across impressive distances as it moved through carboniferous habitats. Unlike the aerial predators already discussed, Paleodictyopterans were plant feeders. Their mouth parts were adapted for piercing and feeding on vegetation. In a landscape filled with giant predators, these large herbivorous insects likely provided an important food source. The skies they occupied differed fundamentally from modern ecosystems. Familiar pollinators had not yet appeared. Bees did not exist. Wasps had not evolved. The intricate relationships that connect flowering plants and insects today remained far in the future. In fact, flowering plants themselves would not emerge until much later. Carboniferous ecosystems relied on entirely different reproductive strategies involving spores, wind dispersal, and plant groups that no longer dominate terrestrial landscapes. Even the fossil record continues to revise the cast of characters. For many years, a fossil known as Megarachne cervinae was celebrated as the largest spider ever discovered. Early interpretations suggested an animal approaching 40 centimeters in size, a truly extraordinary arachnid. Later research overturned that conclusion. Careful reanalysis revealed that Megarachne was not a spider at all. Instead, it belonged to the Eurypterids, an extinct group of aquatic arthropods, often called sea scorpions. The correction serves as a reminder that paleontology remains an evolving science. Fossils rarely arrive with labels attached. New techniques, additional specimens, and improved understanding can transform long-held assumptions. The ancient world continually reveals itself through revision as much as discovery. When all these creatures are considered together, a clearer picture emerges. The Carboniferous was not a landscape containing a few isolated giants. Large arthropods occupied the air, the vegetation, the forest floor, and the margins of wetlands. Different lineages, following different lifestyles, all expanded beyond modern expectations. Their diversity reflected an environment where unusual atmospheric conditions reshaped biological possibilities across an entire ecosystem, creating one of the most distinctive assemblages of invertebrate life Earth has ever known. Step beneath the canopy, and the scale of the Carboniferous becomes easier to understand. Giant insects and oversized arthropods did not exist in isolation. They were products of a landscape as unusual as they were, a landscape whose structure, vegetation, and rhythms differed profoundly from those of any forest alive today. The dominant presence was Lepidodendron, one of the great lycopsid trees. These towering plants could rise to heights of approximately 50 meters, supported by trunks more than a meter across. Their surfaces carried a distinctive pattern of diamond-shaped scars left behind by fallen leaves, creating the textured appearance that inspired the name scale tree. Seen from a distance, they resembled immense pillars lifting upward toward the canopy, often remaining largely unbranched until reaching their crowns high above the ground. Despite their size, these were not trees in the modern sense. Their closest living relatives are humble club mosses, small plants that today often grow close to the ground. Lepidodendron represented an ancient experiment in plant architecture, one that achieved immense proportions through a very different evolutionary pathway. They reproduced using spores rather than seeds, grew rapidly, and lived comparatively brief lives for organisms of such enormous stature. Around them stood other unfamiliar giants, horsetails, whose descendants now survive as slender plants along stream banks and wet ditches reached the dimensions of trees. Dense groves formed along the margins of wetlands, their segmented stems creating thick stands that altered the movement of water and shaped local habitats. Fern-like plants spread through openings in the vegetation, contributing to a layered environment rich in biological productivity. The ground beneath this vegetation possessed a character unlike that of modern forests. Layers of fallen material accumulated continuously. Stems, leaves, spores, and woody tissues gathered faster than they disappeared. Instead of being rapidly recycled through decomposition, much of this organic matter lingered where it fell, building thick deposits across the landscape. Walking through such an environment would have involved navigating a surface that was frequently soft, saturated, and uneven. Water occupied shallow depressions. Plant debris formed tangled mats beneath the vegetation. The distinction between solid ground and wetland was often uncertain, shifting gradually rather than ending at a clear boundary. Light behaved differently here as well. The upper canopy intercepted much of the sunlight before it reached lower levels. Beneath the tallest plants, illumination became subdued and filtered. Visibility through the undergrowth was limited by dense vegetation and the layered structure of the forest itself. Movement beyond short distances would often disappear into overlapping stems and foliage. Humidity remained consistently high. Water evaporated from countless surfaces, lingered in the air, and returned through frequent rainfall. Seasonal contrasts were muted compared with those experienced in many modern forests. Conditions remained relatively stable over long periods, supporting ecosystems that depended on persistent moisture. The accumulated plant matter beneath these forests served another role. Over immense spans of time, layers compressed beneath their own weight. Sediments buried them. Pressure increased. Chemical changes unfolded slowly within the earth. What began as living vegetation gradually transformed into the coal deposits that would survive long after the forests themselves vanished. The Carboniferous swamp forest was therefore more than a habitat. It was an engine of biological production, atmospheric change, and geological transformation. Every towering lycopsid, every grove of giant horsetails, and every layer of accumulating plant matter contributed to a world whose physical character has never been repeated in quite the same way since. Possibility alone does not create giants. A tree may have room to grow, yet remain small if larger size offers no benefit. The same principle applies to animals. By the Carboniferous, atmospheric conditions had expanded the physical limits of arthropod bodies, but an important question remained. Why did so many species actually move toward those new limits instead of remaining modest in size? Growth is expensive. Larger animals require more food, more energy, and more time to reach maturity. They often reproduce more slowly than smaller relatives. In many modern ecosystems, increased size also attracts unwanted attention from predators. Every advantage is balanced by a cost, and natural selection tends to weigh those costs carefully. The Carboniferous altered that balance. High above the forests, a remarkable vacancy existed. Modern skies are crowded with vertebrate hunters. Birds patrol during daylight hours. Bats emerge after sunset. Flying reptiles once occupied similar roles in prehistoric ecosystems. Together, these groups impose constant pressure on aerial insects, favoring maneuverability, concealment, and life histories that reduce vulnerability. None of those hunters existed during the Carboniferous. The atmosphere contained flying insects, but no vertebrate predator had yet evolved the ability to pursue them through open air. Large wings were not accompanied by a proportional increase in danger. An insect could become larger without immediately entering the menu of a new class of specialized hunters. The skies offered opportunity with comparatively little penalty, Conditions on the ground followed a similar pattern. Early tetrapods had already begun exploring terrestrial environments, yet many remained closely associated with water. Their diversity was still limited, and their ecological influence remained modest compared with what vertebrates would later achieve. Large arthropods often occupied positions near the top of local food webs. A giant scorpion, approaching 70 centimeters in length, faced relatively few vertebrate adversaries capable of challenging it. Likewise, other large arthropods could exploit resources that smaller animals struggled to access. Increased size translated into greater reach, stronger mechanical power, and broader dietary possibilities. Predation was only part of the story. Competition also played an important role. Many prey species were becoming larger themselves. Herbivorous insects expanded in size under the same atmospheric conditions affecting predators. As prey increased in mass, predators capable of handling larger meals gained advantages. A hunter adapted for capturing substantial prey could secure more energy from each successful encounter. Researchers often describe this process as an evolutionary arms race. One group changes, creating pressure for another group to respond. Predators improve their abilities, prey develop new strategies, and both sides continue adapting. During the Carboniferous, that contest unfolded across numerous arthropod lineages simultaneously. Body size also provided physiological benefits. Larger animals generally retain heat more effectively than smaller ones. Although the Carboniferous climate was warm, local conditions still varied across regions and seasons. Increased size could buffer organisms against short-term environmental fluctuations while supporting more active lifestyles. Taken together, these factors created a rare evolutionary landscape. Oxygen expanded what arthropods could become. Abundant resources supported growth. Large prey rewarded powerful predators. Vertebrate competition remained relatively weak. The usual penalties associated with gigantism were reduced, while many of the rewards became amplified. In such circumstances, growing larger was not merely possible. For many species, it became one of the most successful strategies available, pushing arthropods toward dimensions that would later seem almost impossible when viewed from the perspective of the modern world. Long before any animal learned to fear a spark, fire had already become one of the great architects of the Carboniferous world. It moved across landscapes, not as a rare disturbance, but as a recurring presence, woven into the ordinary workings of the ecosystem. The same atmospheric conditions that allowed arthropods to reach extraordinary sizes also transformed the behavior of combustion itself, creating a planet far more flammable than the one we know today. At the heart of that transformation was oxygen. By the late Carboniferous, atmospheric oxygen had risen to approximately 35%, a concentration dramatically higher than modern levels. This change altered the chemistry of burning in subtle but profound ways. Materials that resist ignition today became far easier to ignite. Vegetation that would normally smolder or fail to sustain a flame could burn steadily under these enriched conditions. Laboratory experiments have demonstrated that living plant matter can support combustion once oxygen concentrations rise beyond approximately 25%. The Carboniferous exceeded that threshold comfortably. Across vast regions of the equatorial world, forests existed in an atmosphere where the boundary between stability and ignition had become remarkably thin. Lightning provided the spark. Storm systems regularly crossed the humid lowlands, and electrical discharges struck the towering vegetation that dominated the landscape. The upper portions of giant lycopsid forests were especially exposed. A single strike reaching dry tissues high above the saturated ground could initiate a chain reaction. Flames moved through elevated vegetation and eventually reached the immense reserves of accumulated organic material below. The forest floor contained a fuel supply unlike anything present in modern ecosystems. Dead plant matter gathered continuously, building layer upon layer across wetlands and swamp margins. Much of it remained only partially decomposed. Each generation of vegetation added to deposits left by those that came before, creating vast stores of combustible material waiting beneath the living forest. Evidence of these ancient fires survives in the rock record. Coal deposits formed from Carboniferous vegetation frequently contain significant quantities of fossil charcoal known as fusane. In some coal seams, fusane accounts for between 10 and 20% of the total volume. These blackened fragments are direct physical traces of vegetation that once burned hundreds of millions of years ago. One study examining a coal seam in Yorkshire identified at least 18 major fire horizons within a layer approximately 1.8 meters thick. Such findings suggest that large fires may have occurred at intervals of 500 years or less in certain regions. On geological timescales, this represents a remarkably frequent rhythm of burning. Yet these fires were not simply agents of destruction. Life adapted around them. Lycopsid trees developed thick, protective bark capable of resisting heat damage. Vegetation recovered. New growth emerged across burned ground. Organic matter accumulated once again. Fire became part of an ongoing cycle rather than an endpoint. Within that cycle lived the giant insects and arthropods that defined the Carboniferous. Their populations were vast, their habitats extensive, and their world continually renewing itself. Flames could sweep through one region, while life persisted in countless others. Forests regrew, ecosystems reassembled, and the process repeated across millions of years. The Carboniferous was therefore not merely a world of giant creatures, it was also a world shaped by recurring fire, where oxygen, vegetation, and lightning combined to create one of the most combustible landscapes in Earth's history, a landscape that burned, recovered, and burned again beneath an atmosphere unlike any that exists today. Scientific ideas often begin as simple explanations. A pattern appears in the fossil record, a mechanism seems to fit the evidence, and a coherent story emerges. For many years, the story of Carboniferous gigantism appeared straightforward. Oxygen rose, arthropods grew larger, and when oxygen later declined, the giants disappeared. It remains a powerful explanation, supported by substantial evidence. Yet the deeper researchers look, the more complicated the picture becomes. Recent work has added new layers to the discussion. In 2026, a study published in Nature examined one of the most important assumptions behind the oxygen hypothesis. Using electron microscopy and detailed reconstructions of both living insects and fossil forms, researchers investigated the tracheal systems that supplied oxygen to flight muscles. Among the species included in the analysis were reconstructions of giant griffinflies related to Meganeuropsis. The results were unexpected. The smallest branches of the respiratory system, known as tracheoles, occupied less than 1% of total flight muscle volume in both modern insects and reconstructed fossil giants. More importantly, researchers found no meaningful difference between the relative proportions observed in living species and those inferred for the ancient forms. If the largest flying insects were operating near a respiratory limit, the evidence did not clearly reveal it. This finding does not overturn the oxygen hypothesis. Instead, it raises the possibility that the tracheal system may not have been the primary bottleneck researchers once imagined. The giant griffinflies may not have been pressing against a hard physiological boundary imposed by oxygen delivery alone. As a result, scientists have increasingly explored additional explanations. One possibility lies in the remarkable emptiness of the Carboniferous sky. Large flying insects existed in an environment entirely free from vertebrate aerial predators. No birds patrolled above them. No bats emerged after dark. No flying reptiles competed for the same space. Remaining small may simply have offered fewer advantages than it does today. Another possibility involves ecological competition. Predatory griffinflies were not the only organisms increasing in size. Many prey species were becoming larger as well. As herbivorous insects expanded in body dimensions, predators capable of handling bigger targets may have gained a selective advantage. Over time, predator and prey could have influenced each other's evolution, producing a gradual escalation in size across multiple groups. Researchers have also considered the stability of Carboniferous ecosystems themselves. Vast forests persisted for millions of years across enormous regions. Such long-lasting environments may have favored organisms with slower growth, larger bodies, and extended life histories. Evolutionary pressures that would interrupt those strategies in more unstable settings may have been reduced. Viewed together, these ideas suggest a more nuanced picture. Oxygen may have removed a physiological ceiling. The absence of vertebrate hunters may have reduced penalties associated with growing larger. Expanding prey populations may have rewarded increased size. Environmental stability may have allowed those trends to persist over immense spans of time. The most cautious scientific position today is not that one explanation defeated another. It is that several influences likely acted together. The Carboniferous giants probably emerged from an intersection of atmospheric chemistry, ecology, evolutionary competition, and environmental circumstance. Far from weakening the story, this uncertainty reveals something valuable about science itself. Explanations are not monuments carved in stone. They are living models, revised whenever new evidence arrives, growing more detailed as each generation of researchers asks the ancient world to reveal a little more of what it once was. The creatures of the Carboniferous vanished long ago, yet the most enduring legacy of their world was never a fossil, a footprint, or a preserved wing. It was something buried, something compressed beneath layers of sediment and time, hidden underground while continents drifted, mountains rose, and entirely new ecosystems appeared above it. The immense forests that once covered the equatorial regions did not simply disappear when individual plants died. Their remains accumulated in wetlands where decomposition remained incomplete. Layer after layer of organic material settled into waterlogged ground. Sediments gradually buried these deposits, isolating them from the atmosphere and subjecting them to increasing pressure. Over millions of years, physical and chemical transformations slowly altered the buried vegetation. Water was expelled, carbon became concentrated, heat and pressure reshaped the material molecule by molecule. What had once been living forest eventually became coal. This process unfolded across enormous regions of the planet. The coal deposits found today beneath parts of northern Europe, North America, and Asia are direct descendants of those ancient ecosystems. The coal fields of England, the deposits of Pennsylvania, the Appalachian Basin, and the Ruhr Valley in Germany all preserve fragments of a vanished world that flourished more than 300 million years ago. The period itself carries the memory of this transformation in its name. Carboniferous derives from a term meaning carbon-bearing, a reference to the extraordinary abundance of coal left behind. Few intervals in Earth's history have imprinted themselves so directly upon both geology and human civilization. Much later, another species would encounter these buried remains. When industrial societies began extracting coal on a large scale, they tapped into energy that had been stored since the age of giant arthropods. Factories, steam engines, furnaces, railways, and power stations were ultimately fueled by sunlight captured hundreds of millions of years earlier by Carboniferous vegetation. The Industrial Revolution was powered, in a very literal sense, by ancient forests. Seen from a broader perspective, the connection becomes even more remarkable. During the Carboniferous, vast quantities of carbon were removed from the atmosphere and locked underground because dead plant material resisted decay. Oxygen accumulated partly because that carbon remained buried rather than returning immediately to the air. When coal burns, the process moves in the opposite direction. Carbon that remained isolated for hundreds of millions of years combines with oxygen and returns to the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. Every ton of coal consumed releases a portion of that ancient carbon reserve. In this sense, combustion partially reverses the long geological sequence that helped create the unusual atmospheric conditions of the Carboniferous. Even traces of the ancient fires survive within the fuel itself. Coal deposits often contain fossil charcoal known as fusane, frequently representing between 10 and 20% of the material in some seams. These black fragments are remnants of vegetation that burned in prehistoric wildfires before becoming buried and incorporated into the growing deposits. The result is an extraordinary continuity across deep time. The fuel extracted from modern mines contains the remains of forests that supported giant insects, the residues of fires ignited beneath oxygen-rich skies, and the carbon once locked away during one of the most unusual ecological periods in Earth's history. The connection is not symbolic, it is physical. The atmosphere of the present remains linked to the Carboniferous through matter itself, carried forward across hundreds of millions of years in seams of coal formed beneath forests that no longer exist. While giant arthropods occupied much of the attention in the Carboniferous landscape, they were not alone. Along riverbanks, within shallow pools, and across the margins of vast wetlands, another lineage was quietly establishing itself. These animals did not possess exoskeletons, compound eyes, or dozens of legs. They carried an entirely different inheritance, one that began in water and was only beginning to explore the possibilities of land. They were the early tetrapods. Their story stretched back into the Devonian, when certain fish evolved sturdy, limb-like structures capable of supporting weight in shallow environments. Over time, these anatomical experiments produced vertebrates with 4 limbs, flexible necks, and bodies increasingly suited to movement beyond the water's edge. By the Carboniferous, descendants of those pioneers had spread across many regions of the world, yet their conquest of land remained incomplete. Most early tetrapods still depended heavily on aquatic habitats. Water provided protection, feeding opportunities, and a place to reproduce. Their bodies could function on land, but many aspects of their biology remained linked to wetlands, rivers, and swamp systems. They inhabited the boundary between two worlds rather than fully abandoning one for the other. Among the dominant vertebrates of the period were early amphibians. These animals varied considerably in size. Some remained relatively small, while others exceeded a meter in length. Their diets reflected the abundance surrounding them. Fish formed an important food source But many species also preyed upon smaller vertebrates and opportunistically consumed arthropods whenever the opportunity arose. The edges of pools and channels became meeting points between evolutionary lineages. Amphibians hunted where water and land overlapped. Arthropods moved through vegetation nearby. Neither group completely controlled these environments. Instead, they shared them, each exploiting different advantages offered by the Carboniferous landscape. Amid this diversity, another innovation appeared, one whose significance would only become fully apparent much later. The first true reptiles emerged during the Carboniferous. At first glance, they did not seem destined to transform the future. Most were relatively small and represented only a minor component of terrestrial ecosystems. Their importance lay not in their immediate dominance, but in a biological solution they carried within their reproduction. Unlike amphibians, reptiles no longer required open water for egg development. They possessed the amniotic egg, a remarkable evolutionary innovation that enclosed the developing embryo within protective membranes. This self-contained environment supplied moisture, nutrients, and protection, allowing reproduction to occur away from ponds and wetlands. The consequences were profound. An amphibian remained tethered to suitable breeding sites. A reptile gained the freedom to expand into habitats where standing water was scarce or absent. Entire regions previously difficult to colonize became available. Although that advantage would not fully reveal its power for millions of years, the foundation had been established. For the moment, however, reptiles remained minor players. The Carboniferous still belonged largely to arthropods. Giant insects occupied the air. Massive millipede relatives crossed the ground. Predatory scorpions patrolled terrestrial habitats. In many ecosystems, vertebrates were newcomers, sharing space with creatures that had already achieved remarkable success. The balance would not remain unchanged forever, yet during this chapter of Earth's history, the land was a place of coexistence between ancient arthropod dynasties and emerging vertebrate lineages, each pursuing its own path through environments that would eventually shape the future of life on land. A giant insect does not emerge fully formed. Long before wings unfold into the air or compound eyes scan the landscape, growth must occur through a process fundamentally different from that of vertebrates. Bones can expand gradually throughout development, but insects live inside external skeletons. For them, becoming larger requires a more complicated solution. The Carboniferous giants faced the same challenge as every insect alive today. Their bodies were enclosed within rigid exoskeletons, composed primarily of chitin. These protective structures provided support and defense, yet they could not stretch indefinitely. Growth therefore occurred in stages. An insect periodically shed its existing exoskeleton and produced a larger replacement. Each transition marked a new developmental phase known as an instar. Between molts, size remained relatively fixed. Then, within a comparatively short period, the old covering split open and a larger body emerged. The new exoskeleton hardened, growth paused, and the cycle continued. Through repeated molting events, small juveniles gradually transformed into adults. For many carboniferous insects, an important portion of that journey occurred underwater. The wetlands of the period were not occupied solely by mature insects moving through vegetation or crossing the sky. Beneath the surface of ponds, channels, and shallow pools lived immense numbers of juvenile forms. These aquatic stages represented an entire hidden community, one that existed alongside the terrestrial ecosystem yet followed different biological rules. Evidence suggests that giant griffinflies, such as Meganeura, likely resembled modern dragonflies in this respect. Before becoming aerial hunters, their juvenile stages probably spent extended periods as aquatic predators. They hunted within freshwater habitats, feeding, growing, and preparing for the final developmental transition that would eventually carry them into the air. This aquatic phase may hold an important clue to gigantism. Researchers have proposed that elevated oxygen levels affected not only adult insects but also their developing larvae. Water contains dissolved oxygen, and during the Carboniferous, oxygen rich atmospheric conditions influenced aquatic environments as well. Juveniles breathing through specialized gill like structures could access unusually abundant supplies of oxygen throughout critical growth stages. Larger larvae generally produce larger adults. If oxygen rich waters supported greater juvenile growth, the effects would persist long after metamorphosis was complete. The pathway to giant size may therefore have begun long before wings appeared, developing gradually within the hidden aquatic stages of life. Not every giant arthropod followed this pattern. Arthropleura, the enormous millipede relative, grew through a different developmental strategy. Rather than undergoing a transformation into a winged adult form, it expanded incrementally throughout life. Additional body segments appeared as growth progressed, extending its length through successive molts over many years. Despite these differences, a common principle connected the giant arthropods of the Carboniferous. Their unusual dimensions were not restricted to adulthood. Growth occurred within environments already shaped by elevated oxygen availability, abundant resources, and ecological conditions favorable to large bodies. The influence of those conditions reached every stage of development. Eggs developed within oxygen-rich habitats. Juveniles grew within oxygen-rich water and air. Adults inherited the consequences of that growth. By the time the largest insects entered the skies or crossed the forest floor, much of their extraordinary size had already been determined through developmental processes unfolding long before they reached maturity. Gigantism was therefore not merely a feature of adulthood, it was woven through the entire life cycle, from the earliest stages of growth to the final form that emerged into the Carboniferous world. Nothing in the Carboniferous world stood still, even when change unfolded too slowly for any living creature to notice. Beneath the forests, beneath the swamps, beneath the countless generations of insects rising and vanishing, the crust of the planet was moving. Continents drifted across the globe with immense patience, carrying entire ecosystems toward a future they could not avoid. For tens of millions of years, scattered land masses had been converging. By the later stages of the Carboniferous, that process was approaching one of the most significant geographic reorganizations in Earth's history. Gondwana, the vast southern supercontinent, was pressing steadily against Laurussia in the north. The collision was not a single event, but a prolonged sequence of impacts, compressions, and uplifts that reshaped landscapes on a continental scale. The evidence survives today in mountain chains that stretch across modern continents. Eastern North America was being squeezed upward as the ancestral Appalachian Mountains continued to rise. Across Europe, the Hercynian mountain belt was taking shape through similar forces. Farther east, the earliest stages of the Ural Mountains were beginning to emerge. These growing highlands altered far more than the appearance of the land. They changed the movement of air itself. As mountains expanded, they redirected prevailing winds and interrupted established rainfall patterns. Moisture that had once traveled freely across low-lying regions became unevenly distributed. Areas that had remained wet for immense spans of time gradually experienced periods of drying. The transformation was subtle at first, measured not in seasons but in geological intervals. Yet, the direction of change remained remarkably consistent. The great swamp systems that had dominated equatorial regions depended upon constant moisture. Their stability rested on warm temperatures, abundant rainfall, and extensive lowland basins where water could linger. As climatic patterns shifted, these conditions became increasingly fragmented. Continuous wetlands began separating into isolated pockets. Forests that had once stretched uninterrupted across broad regions encountered expanding areas less favorable to their growth. At the same time, another process was unfolding far from the equatorial belt. Across portions of Gondwana, glaciers were becoming more extensive. Ice sheets accumulated across southern high latitudes, locking vast quantities of water onto land. This gradual storage of water lowered global sea levels. Coastal wetlands retreated. Shallow inland seas contracted. Habitats that had existed for millions of years became smaller and less connected. None of these developments arrived suddenly. No singular catastrophe marked the transition. The forests still stood across enormous areas. Thick vegetation continued to bury carbon. Atmospheric oxygen remained unusually elevated. Giant arthropods still occupied the skies, the undergrowth, and the damp margins of the remaining wetlands. Yet the foundations supporting that world were beginning to shift. The assembly of Pangaea was quietly rewriting the environmental conditions that had made Carboniferous gigantism possible. Geography was steering climate toward a cooler and increasingly seasonal state. Wetlands were becoming less stable. Ecological continuity was slowly giving way to fragmentation. Across the swamps, life continued its familiar rhythms, but deep beneath those rhythms, the tectonic machinery of the planet was setting a new course, one measured not in lifetimes, but in millions of years. For millions of years, the great equatorial forests had seemed almost permanent. Their roots occupied the same waterlogged lowlands generation after generation, building vast landscapes of vegetation that stretched across immense portions of the ancient world. Yet permanence in geology is often an illusion. Around 305 million years ago, during the transition between the Moscovian and Casimovian stages, the stability that had defined the Carboniferous began to unravel. The event is known today as the Carboniferous rainforest collapse. Despite the name, it was not a single moment, but a relatively rapid ecological transformation. Measured against a human lifetime, it would have appeared impossibly slow, yet measured against geological history, it happened with startling speed. Forest systems that had persisted for tens of millions of years, fragmented across the equatorial regions of Euramerica, the combined landmass that included much of what would later become Europe and North America. The leading explanation points southward, toward the expanding ice sheets of Gondwana. As glaciation intensified, global climates shifted. Cooler temperatures altered atmospheric circulation and reduced the rainfall that had continuously fed the swamp forests. Moisture became less reliable. Dry intervals became more common. Environments that had once remained saturated year-round gradually crossed ecological thresholds that many carboniferous plants could not tolerate. The consequences appeared in the geological record with remarkable clarity. Coal deposits that had once extended laterally across distances approaching 300 kilometers became increasingly fragmented. Continuous seams gave way to isolated deposits. The pattern suggested not merely shrinking forests, but forests being broken apart into separate remnants. What had once been a connected greenbelt became a patchwork. Each surviving forest stood increasingly alone. Between them stretched expanding regions of habitat, unsuitable for the organisms that had evolved within permanently humid conditions. In the language of modern biogeography, these remnants behaved like islands. Isolation changed everything. Populations became smaller, genetic exchange diminished. Species that had once occupied vast ranges found themselves confined to scattered refuges. The dominant lycopsid trees suffered particularly severe losses. For millions of years, they had defined the architecture of the Carboniferous landscape. Their decline reshaped entire ecosystems. In many regions, fern dominated communities expanded into the spaces they left behind. Early conifer woodlands also became more common, representing a different style of vegetation adapted to conditions that were less dependent on constant saturation. These new plant communities remained successful in their own way, but they did not create the same ecological framework as the forests that preceded them. The effects traveled outward through food webs and atmospheric systems alike. Reduced swamp coverage meant less accumulation of the enormous quantities of plant material that had characterized earlier intervals. Habitats became less predictable. Ecological abundance became more uneven. Organisms that had flourished under the old conditions faced a world that no longer operated according to familiar rules. The Carboniferous rainforest collapse is often classified as a minor extinction event. The label can be misleading. Entire evolutionary pathways survived, yet an ecological world that had endured for tens of millions of years effectively came to an end. The forests did not vanish completely, but their age of dominance quietly passed into history. The disappearance of the giant arthropods did not happen in a single moment. There was no final day when the skies suddenly emptied or when the forest floor fell silent. Instead, their decline unfolded through a series of connected changes, each one weakening the foundations that had supported their extraordinary world for millions of years. The first shift was atmospheric. As the great equatorial forests fragmented, the balance that had sustained unusually high oxygen levels began to change. Vast swamp ecosystems had once buried enormous quantities of organic carbon beneath waterlogged sediments. With fewer continuous forests and less long-term carbon burial, that process slowed. Carbon dioxide returned more readily to the atmosphere, and oxygen gradually declined from its carboniferous peak of roughly 35%. The change was slow on human timescales, yet persistent across geological time. For organisms whose biology had evolved within oxygen-rich conditions, even gradual atmospheric change carried consequences. The environmental margin that had allowed exceptional body sizes became narrower. Large arthropods could still survive, but the world was becoming less favorable for producing new generations of giants. Among the earliest major casualties was Arthropleura. For millions of years, it had traveled across damp landscapes, rich in decaying vegetation. Its immense body depended on habitats that remained consistently moist and productive. By approximately 303 million years ago, during the late Gazzellian stage of the Carboniferous, those habitats had become increasingly fragmented. As wetlands contracted and plant communities changed, the ecological conditions that sustained Arthropleura faded with them. The fossil record suggests the lineage disappeared entirely. The giant griffinflies faced a different challenge. Their adults ruled the air, but their life cycle remained tied to water. Like modern dragonfly relatives, their larvae almost certainly developed within aquatic environments. As swamp systems shrank and breeding pools became less abundant, successful reproduction became increasingly difficult. Fossil evidence indicates a dramatic reduction in meganeurid abundance after the rainforest collapse. In some coal-bearing regions, estimates suggest their occurrence fell by more than 90% compared with earlier intervals. Fragmentation itself became an additional force of decline. Continuous forests had once allowed populations to spread across enormous territories. When those forests broke apart, surviving communities became isolated from one another. Many arthropod species had evolved within specialized ecological settings that existed only inside the humid Carboniferous landscape. Once separated into scattered habitat patches, these populations became vulnerable to local extinction. Recolonization became increasingly difficult as distances between suitable environments grew. The losses were significant enough that researchers estimate roughly 20 to 30% of arthropod genera may have disappeared from Euramerican tropical ecosystems during this interval, although the fossil record remains incomplete and exact figures continue to be debated. The griffinfly lineage itself endured long after the Carboniferous ended. Descendants survived into the Permian, lingering for tens of millions of years beyond the collapse of the great coal forests. Yet survival was not the same as dominance. The trend had already been established. Across successive generations, the largest forms became rarer and average body sizes gradually declined. The age of giant arthropods did not end with an extinction event alone. It ended because the world that had allowed such creatures to exist was slowly becoming something else. Opportunity often arrives disguised as disruption. As the great Carboniferous forests fragmented and ancient ecological networks weakened, many of the organisms that had flourished for millions of years found themselves increasingly constrained. Yet, within the same changing landscape, a different group encountered conditions that favored expansion rather than decline. The beneficiaries were the earliest amniotes, a broad category that included primitive reptiles and the close relatives of the synapsids, the lineage that would one day give rise to mammals. During the height of the swamp world, these animals occupied only a modest portion of the terrestrial ecosystem. They shared the landscape with abundant amphibians and giant arthropods, neither dominant nor particularly conspicuous. As environmental conditions shifted, however, traits that once seemed merely useful became powerful advantages. The most significant of these innovations was reproduction independent of standing water. Amphibians remained closely tied to moist environments because their eggs required wet conditions to survive. Amniotes had solved that problem through the evolution of the amniotic egg, a remarkable biological structure that enclosed the developing embryo within protective membranes. The egg carried its own aquatic environment, allowing reproduction to occur far from ponds, marshes, and swamp margins. As rainfall patterns changed and wetlands became less reliable, this difference grew increasingly important. Amniotes could move across drier terrain without losing access to breeding opportunities. They could establish populations in regions that amphibians struggled to occupy. Areas that had once been ecological barriers gradually became pathways. The fragmented world left behind by the Carboniferous rainforest collapse also created conditions favorable to evolutionary experimentation. Populations that had once belonged to continuous ecosystems became isolated from one another. Small groups found themselves separated by stretches of unsuitable habitat, confined within ecological refuges scattered across the landscape. Isolation reduced genetic exchange and allowed populations to follow independent evolutionary paths. Research, published in the journal Geology during 2010 and supported by later studies, suggests that this fragmentation accelerated diversification among early tetrapods, particularly within the amniote lineages. The pattern resembles processes observed on islands today. Diversity initially falls when habitats are disrupted, yet surviving populations often adapt rapidly as they encounter new environmental pressures and newly available ecological roles. Across the emerging Permian world, these descendants spread outward. Some expanded into upland environments, others moved into increasingly arid regions. Their distribution gradually extended beyond the equatorial zones that had dominated earlier terrestrial life. Each expansion opened additional evolutionary possibilities, creating lineages that differed more and more from their Carboniferous ancestors. The consequences would echo across hundreds of millions of years. From these early amniotes emerged an extraordinary diversity of descendants. Some branches would eventually produce the reptiles that came to dominate later eras. Others would continue along the synapsid pathway, ultimately leading to mammals. The foundations of those futures were being established during this interval of ecological reorganization. The irony is difficult to miss. The oxygen-rich forests and arthropod-dominated ecosystems of the Carboniferous helped shape the environmental conditions that encouraged amniote innovation. The giants of the Old World did not simply vanish and leave an empty stage. Through the changes they influenced and the landscapes they helped create, they contributed to the rise of the creatures that would inherit the land after them. Some chapters in Earth's history feel less like permanent states and more like brief alignments, moments when a collection of unlikely circumstances overlap and create possibilities that exist nowhere else before or after. The age of giant arthropods belonged to one of those alignments. It emerged from a combination of atmospheric chemistry, evolutionary timing, ecological structure, and geological circumstance that no longer exists on the modern planet. Looking only at oxygen, it might seem tempting to imagine a return. During the peak of the Carboniferous, atmospheric oxygen reached approximately 35%, vastly higher than the roughly 21% that surrounds the Earth today. Such conditions helped remove physiological constraints that had limited the size of many arthropods, yet the oxygen spike itself depended on processes that have long since disappeared. The ancient forests accumulated immense quantities of woody material because the biological machinery required to efficiently recycle it had not fully evolved. Dead plant matter entered wetlands and remained there, storing carbon instead of returning it rapidly to the atmosphere. Over time, this imbalance allowed oxygen concentrations to climb. That pathway is now effectively closed. By approximately 290 million years ago, fungi capable of breaking down lignin had become widespread. Since then, woody debris has been recycled far more efficiently. Forests still store carbon, but they no longer create the same planetary scale imbalance that characterized the Carboniferous world. Even if atmospheric oxygen somehow returned to 35%, the outcome would not resemble the ancient past. The ecological landscape has changed beyond recognition. Modern skies are crowded with specialized vertebrate flyers. Birds patrol forests, coastlines, grasslands, and mountains. Bats emerge each evening to hunt insects with remarkable efficiency. Small reptiles, mammals, and countless other predators participate in food webs that simply did not exist during the age of griffinflies. A giant flying insect in the modern world would not inhabit an empty aerial realm. It would enter an environment already occupied by fast, intelligent, and highly adaptable hunters. Large body size would bring visibility as well as vulnerability. Any advantage gained through oxygen-rich conditions would be counterbalanced by predation pressures unknown to Carboniferous ecosystems. Recent research has added further complexity to the story. A study published during 2026 examined the respiratory structures of both living insects and reconstructed fossil griffinflies. The results suggested that oxygen diffusion alone may not fully explain the upper limits of insect size. Other influences, including predator absence, ecological opportunity, and long term evolutionary competition, may have played equally important roles. If that interpretation proves correct, restoring atmospheric conditions alone would never recreate Carboniferous gigantism. The giant insects existed because many factors aligned simultaneously. Exceptional oxygen levels, unusual forest dynamics, extensive wetland habitats, limited aerial predation, and evolutionary opportunity all overlapped within the same span of time. Remove any one of those elements, and the outcome changes. The Carboniferous was therefore not a blueprint waiting to repeat itself. It was a narrow window in Earth's history, opened by circumstances unique to its age. For tens of millions of years, that window remained open. Then geology, climate, biology, and evolution carried the planet onward, and it quietly closed behind them, long after the forests vanished and the giant arthropods disappeared. Traces of their world remained hidden beneath layers of stone. The evidence is rarely dramatic when first uncovered. A fragment of wing pressed into shale, a line of footprints hardened in ancient mud, a scatter of spores trapped within dark rock. Yet, from these scattered remnants, an entire vanished ecosystem has gradually emerged. The Carboniferous is known primarily through coal measures, thick sequences of sedimentary rock formed from the accumulation and burial of ancient plant material. These deposits preserve far more than fuel. They are geological archives, recording the structure of forests, the chemistry of the atmosphere, the history of wildfire, and the animals that moved through those long-lost wetlands. Every excavation into a coal-bearing formation is, in a sense, an excavation into a vanished landscape. Recovering insects from such deposits presents particular challenges. Unlike vertebrates, insects possess no internal skeleton. Their bodies are protected by exoskeletons that are lightweight and efficient in life, but fragile in death. Most individuals disappear without leaving any trace. Fossilization requires a rare combination of rapid burial, low oxygen conditions, and minimal disturbance. Even then, preservation is often incomplete. For that reason, wings dominate the fossil record of giant insects. Wing veins form intricate patterns that function almost like fingerprints, allowing paleontologists to identify species from surprisingly small fragments. The famous griffinfly Meganeura was described in 1885 from fossil wing material recovered in France. Decades later, Meganeuropsis entered the scientific record from an incomplete wing discovered in Kansas. Neither specimen represented a complete animal, yet the preserved structures contained enough information to estimate proportions, classify relationships, and reconstruct the appearance of creatures that vanished hundreds of millions of years ago. Some discoveries reveal behavior rather than anatomy. Arthropleura provides a remarkable example. Its body fossils are valuable, but its fossil trackways are equally important. Preserved in ancient sediment, these trails record stride length, body width, direction of movement, and interaction with the landscape. They transform a static fossil into evidence of a living animal crossing a carboniferous surface that briefly existed and then disappeared forever beneath accumulating sediment. Other species survive only because preservation conditions happen to be unusually favorable. Pulmonoscorpius is known from East Kirkton Quarry in Scotland, a site whose geological circumstances captured an extraordinary snapshot of early terrestrial life. Without that single locality, knowledge of one of the largest known scorpions would be vastly poorer. The rocks themselves continue telling stories beyond the fossils embedded within them. Fossilized charcoal, known as fusane, records ancient fire activity. Spores and pollen reveal which plants dominated different environments. Ratios of chemical elements preserved in sediments help reconstruct atmospheric conditions and environmental change. Each layer contributes another piece to a puzzle assembled across generations of research. The picture remains incomplete, yet it grows sharper with every discovery. Paleontologists work much like forensic investigators, examining a scene long after the event itself has passed. No single fragment explains the whole story, but when thousands of fragments are gathered, compared, and interpreted together, an ancient world gradually returns to view with remarkable clarity. There is a quiet challenge at the heart of deep time science. Fossils can be touched, rocks can be collected, ancient footprints can be measured, but air leaves no bones behind. The atmosphere that drifted above Carboniferous forests vanished hundreds of millions of years ago, dispersed and recycled through endless planetary change. Yet, modern science has found ways to recover its story with surprising precision. The reconstruction begins not with the sky itself, but with the traces the sky left behind. Every living organism interacts with the atmosphere. Plants absorb carbon. Oceans exchange gases with the air above them. Sediments record chemical conditions as they accumulate. Over immense stretches of time, these interactions become part of the geological record, preserving clues that can be examined long after the atmosphere that created them has disappeared. One of the most important tools in this effort is geochemical modeling. Among the most influential is a framework known as GeoCarb, first developed during the 1990s and refined repeatedly as new evidence became available. Rather than relying on a single source of information, the model combines data from fossil plants, marine sediments, weathering rates, volcanic activity, and isotope measurements. Each dataset contributes a small piece of the larger picture. Together, they allow scientists to estimate how carbon and oxygen moved through Earth's systems across hundreds of millions of years. A particularly valuable clue comes from carbon isotopes. Carbon exists in slightly different forms, known as isotopes, and plants do not use all of them equally. During photosynthesis, living tissues preferentially incorporate specific isotopic ratios. When ancient plant material becomes buried and preserved, those ratios remain locked within the rock. By measuring them, researchers can estimate how much organic carbon was being removed from circulation and stored underground during different periods of Earth's history. That buried carbon matters because oxygen production and carbon burial are linked. When vast quantities of plant material accumulate without fully decomposing, carbon becomes trapped while oxygen remains in the atmosphere. The greater the imbalance, the greater the potential rise in atmospheric oxygen. Through this relationship, the chemistry of ancient vegetation becomes a window into the composition of ancient air. Another line of evidence comes from fire itself. Fossilized charcoal, preserved within sedimentary deposits, acts as a remarkably useful atmospheric indicator. Combustion requires a minimum oxygen concentration. Experimental studies demonstrate that sustained wildfire becomes impossible below roughly 13% atmospheric oxygen. When charcoal appears abundantly in the geological record, it indicates oxygen levels comfortably above that threshold. During the Carboniferous, charcoal becomes extraordinarily common, providing an independent line of evidence that supports elevated oxygen estimates. What makes the reconstruction especially convincing is that multiple approaches arrive at similar conclusions. Isotope studies, sediment records, wildfire indicators, and geochemical models all point toward a substantial oxygen peak during the Carboniferous, followed by a gradual decline through the Permian. The timing closely parallels the rise and eventual disappearance of arthropod gigantism across the fossil record. No scientist can collect a sample of Carboniferous air. The atmosphere itself is long gone, yet fragments of its history remain scattered through stone, charcoal, buried wood, and ancient chemistry. Piece by piece, those fragments form an atmospheric clock, allowing a vanished sky to be read long after its winds have fallen silent. A long twilight settled over the age of giant arthropods. It did not arrive as a sudden catastrophe, nor as a single dramatic turning point. Instead, it unfolded gradually across millions of years as the world that had once favored immense insects and sprawling swamp ecosystems continued its slow transformation into something different. The Carboniferous period ended approximately 298.9 million years ago. In its place came the Permian, a chapter of Earth's history shaped by new climates, new landscapes, and new ecological pressures. The continents had drawn ever closer together, assembling into the vast supercontinent Pangaea. Inland regions became increasingly distant from moisture-bearing seas. Seasonal extremes strengthened. Many of the permanently saturated environments that had once stretched across equatorial regions began retreating into smaller and more fragmented refuges. Yet, the giants did not vanish immediately. Among the survivors were the griffinflies, descendants of the aerial predators that had ruled the skies for tens of millions of years. Fossils from Permian deposits demonstrate that some remained impressively large. Meganeuropsis permiana, discovered in Kansas and named for the geological period in which it lived, is evidence that giant flying insects continued long after the Carboniferous forests had begun their decline. For a time, these creatures still crossed ancient skies with wings broader than those of many modern birds. But survival and prosperity are not the same thing. The environmental foundations that had supported gigantism were steadily weakening. Atmospheric oxygen was no longer maintaining the exceptional heights reached during the Carboniferous peak. Forest fragmentation reduced the extent of humid habitats. Aquatic breeding grounds became less widespread. Ecological networks that had once stretched continuously across enormous regions were increasingly broken into disconnected patches. The change was subtle on the scale of a single generation, yet profound on the scale of geological time. Each passing million years carried the world slightly further from the conditions that had allowed giant arthropods to flourish. Their populations persisted, but the trend pointed steadily in one direction. Meanwhile, new groups continued expanding into ecological roles that had once belonged primarily to arthropods. Reptiles diversified, synapsids spread into emerging environments. Terrestrial ecosystems became increasingly shaped by vertebrate lineages whose evolutionary trajectories were only beginning. Then came one of the most devastating biological crises in Earth's history. Approximately 252 million years ago, near the end of the Permian, immense volcanic eruptions associated with the Siberian traps released extraordinary quantities of gases into the atmosphere. Climate systems destabilized, oceans suffered widespread oxygen loss, ecosystems across the planet experienced collapse. The event that followed, often called the Great Dying, eliminated approximately 96% of marine species and roughly 70% of terrestrial vertebrate species. The griffinflies survived the initial catastrophe, but only briefly. Their final appearances in the fossil record occur around 247 million years ago. By then, the world that had created them was unimaginably distant. The oxygen-rich forests were gone. The ecological conditions that once favored giant insects had long since faded. Their ending was quiet. No final swarm fills the record. No singular moment marks their disappearance. The fossils simply become rarer, then rarer still, until eventually they stop. Their lineage endured for roughly 70 million years after the beginning of its rise, carrying the memory of an older Earth long after that Earth itself had passed away. Some legacies are written in stone, others survive in coal seams, fossil wings, or ancient footprints. A few, perhaps, linger in places far more difficult to examine. Not in the rock record, but in the architecture of living minds. The giant arthropods of the Carboniferous vanished hundreds of millions of years ago. Their forests disappeared. Their ecosystems collapsed. Their descendants shrank into forms that would seem almost insignificant beside their enormous ancestors. Yet despite their disappearance, insects and spiders continue to provoke reactions in humans that often seem disproportionate to the danger they actually present. A small spider crossing a wall can trigger an immediate physical response. A sudden movement from an insect can produce a recoil before conscious thought has fully formed. These reactions emerge rapidly, often bypassing deliberate reasoning. They are familiar across cultures and appear with remarkable consistency throughout much of the world. Modern surveys provide some measure of this phenomenon. A study conducted by Chapman University in 2016 found that approximately 1/4 of respondents identified insects or spiders as a significant fear. Among specific phobias, arthropods ranked near the top of the list. The prevalence is striking because most people living today rarely encounter insects capable of causing serious harm. This observation has led some evolutionary psychologists to propose an intriguing possibility. Perhaps certain fear responses did not arise randomly. Perhaps they reflect ancient threat detection systems shaped by long histories of interaction between vertebrates and arthropods. Under this view, rapid sensitivity to many-legged creatures may once have offered a survival advantage, allowing animals to react quickly to potentially dangerous encounters before careful analysis became possible. The idea remains controversial. Human fears are influenced by culture, learning, personal experience, and countless environmental factors. Not every widespread fear requires a deep evolutionary explanation. Researchers continue debating how much of human phobia originates from inherited predispositions and how much develops through individual experience. The evidence does not permit simple conclusions. Yet the possibility remains difficult to ignore entirely. The early synapsids that emerged from the ecological upheavals of the late Carboniferous and early Permian inhabited landscapes very different from those of modern mammals. Some shared their environment with scorpions far larger than those alive today. Others lived beneath skies patrolled by immense predatory insects. They occupied ecosystems in which arthropods could dominate food webs in ways that seem unfamiliar from a modern perspective. Those ancient synapsids were not human. They were distant ancestors separated from us by immense stretches of time and evolutionary change. Nevertheless, every mammal alive today traces its lineage through those remote populations. The biological foundations of modern nervous systems were assembled gradually across that long journey. Whether any trace of those interactions survives within contemporary fear responses remains unresolved. Current science cannot test the question directly. The relevant events occurred too far in the past, and the pathways linking behavior to evolutionary history are extraordinarily complex. Still, there is something quietly fascinating about the possibility. The giant arthropods may have vanished long ago, leaving behind only fossils and geological clues. Yet, in certain moments, in the sudden instinctive attention given to a rapidly moving insect or the uneasy awareness triggered by a spider's silhouette, there lingers a faint suggestion that deep history sometimes echoes in unexpected places. Viewed from within a single lifetime, the world often appears orderly. Causes seem connected to effects. Actions appear to produce predictable outcomes. Yet deep time tells a different story, one in which consequences travel across millions of years, crossing boundaries between life, rock, water, and air until their origins become almost impossible to recognize. The Carboniferous offers one of the clearest examples of this strange interconnectedness. A plant evolved a new way of building itself. That was all. No grand transformation announced its arrival. No dramatic threshold marked the moment. Certain ancient plants began producing lignin, a remarkably durable structural material that allowed trunks to rise higher, support more weight, and compete more effectively for sunlight. The advantage was immediate. Taller plants gained greater access to light. Forests expanded. New ecological opportunities emerged. Yet the most significant consequences were not visible among the living trees themselves. They appeared after the trees died. For a time, the biological world possessed lignin, but lacked efficient decomposers capable of fully breaking it down. Vast quantities of woody material accumulated across wet equatorial lowlands. Layer upon layer, settled into waterlogged sediments where decay slowed dramatically. Carbon that would ordinarily have returned to the atmosphere remained trapped underground instead. As burial continued across immense spans of time, another process unfolded above. Oxygen accumulated in the atmosphere because photosynthesis continued, releasing it while large amounts of carbon remained locked away. No organism intended this outcome. No species was adapting toward an oxygen-rich future. The atmosphere simply responded to the balance of inputs and outputs operating across the planetary system. The consequences spread outward. Elevated oxygen altered combustion dynamics and increased the frequency of wildfire. It expanded physiological possibilities for arthropods whose respiratory systems functioned under different constraints than those of vertebrates. Giant insects emerged, not because evolution sought gigantism, but because the environmental conditions permitted it. The appearance of enormous dragonflies, giant millipedes, and oversized scorpions was one expression of a much broader chain of events already in motion. Meanwhile, beneath the surface, the accumulated plant material continued its own slow transformation. Pressure increased, temperatures rose, sediments compressed. Over millions of years, the remains of Carboniferous forests became coal deposits distributed across multiple continents. The forests vanished, but their stored carbon remained hidden underground long after the ecosystems that created it had disappeared. Hundreds of millions of years later, another species arrived. Humans extracted that buried carbon and burned it for energy. Factories, railways, power stations, and industrial cities drew upon biological material produced in a world populated by creatures long extinct. The connection was not planned. It was the continuation of consequences set in motion far beyond any human horizon. Scientists describe Earth as a coupled system because no part operates in isolation. The atmosphere influences life. Life reshapes geology. Geology alters climate. Climate redirects evolution. Changes propagate through the entire system, sometimes slowly enough that the full result remains invisible for millions of years. The Carboniferous stands as a remarkable illustration of that principle. A structural innovation in ancient plants became an atmospheric transformation, an ecological experiment, a geological archive, and eventually part of the foundation of industrial civilization. There was no blueprint guiding the process. There was only consequence, following consequence, through deep time, each step emerging naturally from the one before it, as Earth quietly engineered outcomes no individual part could ever have foreseen. Numbers can become strangely weightless when they grow large enough. 1,000 years feels immense. 1,000,000 years feels almost abstract. Beyond that, the mind begins to lose its grip. Yet the Carboniferous demands that scale be taken seriously, because the duration of that world was one of its most remarkable features. The Carboniferous lasted approximately 60 million years. That span is difficult to appreciate without comparison. The interval separating the extinction of the non-avian dinosaurs from the present day is approximately 66 million years. In that time, mammals diversified, grasslands appeared, whales returned to the oceans, flowering plants reshaped ecosystems, ice ages came and went, and humans eventually emerged. Entire biological revolutions unfolded within that single stretch of time. The Carboniferous occupied nearly the same length of history. For all those millions of years, vast equatorial wetlands persisted across enormous regions of the planet. Generations of forests rose, matured, died, and were replaced. Rivers shifted course. Sea levels advanced and retreated. Wildfires flared and faded. Countless organisms lived entire evolutionary histories within a world whose basic ecological character remained recognizable across spans of time almost beyond comprehension. Within that enduring setting, giant arthropods were not temporary curiosities. They were established participants in stable ecosystems. The great griffinflies patrolled ancient skies for tens of millions of years. Arthropleura crossed damp landscapes for intervals longer than the entire history of humanity. Their existence stretched across periods so vast that mountain ranges changed shape while their descendants continued to survive. Modern humans have existed for roughly 300,000 years. Written history occupies only a small fraction of that interval. The largest cities, nations, and civilizations belong to the most recent moments of our story. By comparison, the griffinfly lineage persisted for approximately 70 million years. It endured longer than many groups that later came to dominate the planet. Seen from this perspective, the disappearance of the Carboniferous world was not the ending of a brief experiment. It was the loss of an ancient and successful ecological system that had remained functional for a duration almost impossible to visualize. Entire landscapes that once seemed permanent eventually vanished, leaving only scattered traces preserved in stone. Those traces surround modern civilization more closely than most people realize. The coal extracted from mines in Europe, North America, and Asia originated within that vanished world. Buried plant matter accumulated across millions of years, compressed slowly beneath sediments, and transformed into concentrated stores of chemical energy. The process required spans of time so immense that human history barely registers against them. When factories of the 18th and 19th centuries burned coal, they were drawing upon sunlight captured hundreds of millions of years earlier. Modern power stations continue the same exchange. What appears to be fuel is also geological memory, ancient biological productivity condensed into black rock. We did not create that energy, we uncovered it. Long before the first dinosaur walked the earth, Before mammals existed, before birds filled the skies, Carboniferous ecosystems were already storing it beneath the ground. Deep time performed the work. Much later, humanity simply found the key to release what had been waiting there all along. Absence can shape a world as profoundly as presence. By the time the great arthropod giants faded from the landscape, the stage they had occupied for so long was not left empty. Ecological space rarely remains vacant for long. Life moves into openings, experiments with new possibilities, and gradually builds unfamiliar worlds from the remains of old ones. The Permian inherited a planet already transformed by drying climates, fragmented forests, and shifting ecosystems. The enormous swamp networks that had once stretched across equatorial regions no longer dominated the land. New environments expanded across vast areas, bringing opportunities for organisms equipped to exploit them. Among the most important beneficiaries were the synapsids, a diverse group whose distant descendants would eventually include mammals. During the Permian, these animals spread into ecological roles that had previously been rare or unavailable. Some became active predators, capable of pursuing prey across open terrain. Others specialized in feeding on vegetation. Still others adapted to digging, sheltering underground, or surviving in increasingly seasonal environments. Compared with the giant arthropods that preceded them, these vertebrates possessed different advantages. Internal skeletons supported larger and more varied body plans. Stronger jaws allowed access to new food sources. More complex sensory systems improved interactions with changing surroundings. Over time, ecological influence shifted steadily toward creatures whose bodies were organized around entirely different solutions to survival. The transition was gradual rather than sudden. For millions of years, remnants of older ecosystems persisted alongside emerging ones. Ancient lineages lingered, even as newer groups expanded. Earth often changes this way, not through immediate replacement, but through long periods of overlap during which the future quietly accumulates strength. Then another upheaval arrived. Near the end of the Permian, volcanic activity associated with the Siberian traps triggered environmental disruption on a scale unmatched elsewhere in the geological record. The resulting extinction erased vast portions of life across both land and sea. Ecosystems collapsed, familiar lineages vanished, yet even within catastrophe, survival created opportunity. The groups that endured became the foundations of later worlds. Among them were ancestors of crocodilians, dinosaurs, and mammals. Their success was not predetermined. They happened to possess combinations of traits that allowed recovery in environments profoundly altered by crisis. From those survivors emerged the biological architecture of the Mesozoic and much later the modern Earth. Insects, meanwhile, followed a different path. They never disappeared, nor did they retreat into insignificance. Instead, they diversified with extraordinary success. Without atmospheric conditions favoring gigantism, evolution moved toward other strategies. Bodies became smaller, development faster, behaviors more specialized, and ecological relationships increasingly intricate. As new plant groups appeared, insects formed partnerships that reshaped terrestrial ecosystems. Flowering plants eventually spread across continents, and insects became essential participants in their reproduction. Pollination networks expanded into some of the most important biological systems on Earth. Entire food webs came to depend upon interactions between flowers and insects. The bees and wasps absent from Carboniferous landscapes eventually emerged as pivotal ecological actors. Their influence reached far beyond their size, helping sustain forests, grasslands, and agricultural systems across the globe. The age of giant insects ended, but the age that followed proved no less remarkable. Size gave way to specialization, abundance, and complexity. The monsters disappeared, yet their successors became woven into nearly every corner of the living world that exists today. Sometimes the deepest stories are not about the creatures themselves. They are about the chain of events that allowed those creatures to exist at all. Long after the names fade and the bodies disappear, the sequence remains, stretching across immense spans of time like a thread woven through the history of the planet. The Carboniferous invites that kind of perspective. Its giant insects capture attention immediately, yet they were only one visible expression of a much larger process unfolding beneath the surface. Their existence depended upon forests. The forests depended upon ancient innovations in plant biology. The atmosphere responded to those innovations. Climate responded to the atmosphere. Fire responded to climate. Evolution responded to all of them at once. A tree evolved lignin because stronger tissues offered an advantage. The molecule endured. Dead wood accumulated faster than existing decomposers could process it. Carbon became buried in extraordinary quantities. Oxygen slowly increased. No guiding intelligence coordinated these events. No mechanism anticipated what would follow. Each step emerged naturally from the conditions that preceded it. Over millions of years, those consequences accumulated. The atmosphere shifted. Arthropods expanded into possibilities unavailable in earlier ages. Predators grew larger. Herbivores grew larger. Entire ecosystems adjusted around new biological limits. The world became, for a time, a place where giant insects were not extraordinary. They were simply appropriate responses to the environment around them. Yet nothing in Earth's history remains fixed. Continents continued moving, mountain ranges rose, rainfall patterns changed, temperatures shifted, forests fragmented. The conditions that had once supported gigantism gradually disappeared. The same planet that enabled those organisms quietly withdrew the circumstances they required. There is a certain simplicity in that pattern. Life does not receive permanent guarantees. Success in one world does not ensure success in the next. Organisms become well suited to specific environments, and when those environments change, different solutions emerge. The giant arthropods were not failures. They were not evolutionary dead ends. For millions upon millions of years, they were remarkably successful, occupying their niches with extraordinary effectiveness. When conditions changed, the answers changed as well. The traces they left behind remain surprisingly tangible. Their wings survive as impressions in stone. Their trackways cross ancient sediments. Their forests became coal. Their wildfires became charcoal preserved in buried seams. Even the atmosphere carries echoes of processes that began during their age. The Carboniferous did not vanish completely. It became part of everything that followed. Perhaps that is the quiet lesson hidden within the deep record. Earth is not a sequence of isolated chapters. Each age inherits the consequences of those before it. Innovations become environments. Environments become pressures. Pressures become new forms of life. The results ripple forward through time, long after their origins have disappeared from view. The Carboniferous ended approximately 299 million years ago, yet its influence remains embedded in landscapes, ecosystems, geology, and climate. A tree that could not fully rot helped reshape the atmosphere. The atmosphere helped shape giant insects. Their world disappeared, but the consequences endured. And the chain has never broken. It continues even now, consequence following consequence through deep time, linking an ancient swamp forest to the living world outside the window today.